All right. This is Sarah Morrison. It's just now after 9:30, so we'll go ahead and get started with the subcommittee call. Appreciate all of you joining us today, and I want to make sure from our board member perspective, we know who's on the call. I believe we've got Lillian Hartgrove, Bob Eby, and Mike Edwards. Is that correct? Any other board members that have joined us? Great. Well, we are glad to have all three of you, and I thought I would just make a quick mention before turning over to Lillian, and she and I will kind of tag team some opening comments. But this will be her first meeting officially serving as chair of this subcommittee, given that Fielding Ralston, our longtime board chair and also chair of this subcommittee, stepped down in April at the end of his last term. So Lillian, thank you for agreeing not only to serve as chair of the board, but also to chair this important subcommittee on educator preparation and licensure.
Thank you, Sarah. It's my pleasure to serve, and I do want to welcome everyone who's joining us today for the Educator Preparation and Licensure Subcommittee. That's a lot to say.
Yes,
That's a tongue twister. I also want to welcome Bob Eby, who's joining this subcommittee for the first time. And Bob, we certainly appreciate your willingness to serve on this incredibly important subcommittee. Sarah, I think we're going to start with a recap of our last meeting, which I'm prepared to do, or unless there's anything else you want to say before we proceed.
No, the only thing I would note is Bob is not officially on this subcommittee, but we appreciate him joining us. As again, all members are invited to join these subcommittee calls when we have them. He's going to be serving on our advisory council for the teacher prep report card, so we're excited and think there's a lot of crossover between the two groups that are going to be working on educator prep related issues. Daryl Cobbins.
Well, and then I did get my wires crossed.
Well, no worries.
No problem.
So you don't want to join us, Bob?
I think
Bob, if you want to raise your right hand, we can get you on this.
I was going to say, wouldn't take much.
Swear you in right now. Anyway, well, we will start with a recap from our last meeting, which was held in person on March the 13th, and I do want to make sure that anyone who wants to have access to the greater details, they can be found on the state board's website. So that meeting began with Commissioner McQueen providing an educator preparation and licensure progress report from the past 3 years, and the committee members were really pleased to see the progress that had been made during the last 3 years. But we also recognize that we still have work to do as we continue to prioritize educator preparation and licensure. We also discussed a review of licensure assessments the educator committee took on in 2017, and we offered guidance to state staff on potential changes to the professional assessments policy. We understand that the department does intend to bring revisions to that policy to our July meeting for first reading. Licensure assessments are the one way we are able to ensure that all prospective teachers have the content knowledge necessary to be effective in the classroom. The 2017 teacher prep report card had just launched the month before our meeting, so we received an overview of that online tool from our state board staff. We also heard feedback from educator preparation providers and school district staff on how they are using the report card and suggestions for continued improvement. The Department of Education also shared information about the annual reports, which came out in February as well. These detailed reports are specifically for each educator preparation provider and give them candidate level detail of strengths and areas for improvement. The reports will also help inform interim reviews if programs do not meet expectations for 2 years in a row. And finally, the department closed with brief updates on several topics, including partnerships, mentoring, and instructional leadership. And we look forward to hearing more about the department's ongoing work later in this meeting. I do also want to point out to you all that the subcommittee was certainly appreciative of the meeting and the amount of information that was being shared with us, but it was an incredibly large amount of information to share in a very limited amount of time. And so to engage appropriately on each topic and to really become more knowledgeable ourselves, we determined that we need to meet more frequently. And so as a result, we've determined that we will meet quarterly and rotate between in-person and conference call meetings. Sarah, is there anything that you want to add before we move into the agenda?
That's a great recap of our last meeting. The only thing that I wanted to add was just to tee up for this meeting, Lillian, a few goals and objectives that we had in thinking, just like you described, about using these calls in particular to kind of have a through line for the work so that we weren't waiting too long between meetings to update members on the subcommittee of a lot of the work that's happening across the state board and the department staff in these various areas. So for today, as you look through the agenda, really our goals are first and foremost to discuss and inform you about EdTPA and the latest round of data that we've collected this spring, and begin to think as a subcommittee about implementation plans given the data. Want to think and understand more about the research on the importance of teacher diversity and to lay the groundwork for some future conversations on that important topic. And then give you key updates on various key projects across the state board and the department, including the teacher prep report card, our annual reports that come out of the Department of Education, and where we are with leader preparation and some of the policies related to that. And then finally, begin to consider key state board actions for 2018-19 across the spectrum of these licensure and preparation issues that the subcommittee will be discussing. So those are just high-level goals, and with that, I think we're ready to jump into the agenda, Lillian, if you are.
I am ready, thank you. So Spencer is up first. He has EdTPA implementation and cut score options to present to us. Spencer?
Thank you. So yeah, we are moving forward with our implementation of EdTPA as a required statewide assessment. So I'm just going to go through a little bit of background on what EdTPA is, what the current policy in place is for EdTPA implementation, and then some of the data that I've found in doing some research on EdTPA and sharing some of the concerns that I have and that we have based on the data about the current plan and some of our options for moving forward. So EdTPA was first introduced into Tennessee in November of 2011 when we updated the professional assessments policy to allow Tennessee educators to substitute a passing score on the EdTPA assessment for the professional educator assessment requirements that we have in rule for pedagogical assessments. So what EdTPA is it's basically a portfolio model assessment that allows teachers to submit evidence of their actual teaching and video clips from them in the classroom. And basically, it's more than just a multiple choice assessment like the practice assessments that we use, but we think it really does a better job of looking at the skills that are required to be a successful teacher. And so we're really excited about allowing that to become a bigger part of our policy statewide. So in October 2016, at that board meeting, we passed another update to the professional assessments policy that required educator candidates to pass the EdTPA in order to receive a license. And so at that point, we also allowed ed prep providers to continue to set their own passing scores or qualifying scores for the EdTPA until January 1st, 2019, which is when it's going to become a requirement statewide. But until then, the EPPs themselves can set a qualifying score anywhere from 37, which was the initial qualifying score that we established and continue to use, up to 42, which is going to be the new qualifying score as of January. And again, completers who did take the EdTPA at these EPPs could substitute that for their Praxis Principles of Learning and Teaching assessment and their required discipline. And then as of January, as of right now, we are scheduled to have our qualifying score for the EdTPA increased to 42, which would be the highest in the nation. I believe there are several other states that have set a qualifying score of 41, but we would be the first to have a score of 42. And just as a reference point, that's out of 75 points total. There are 15 different rubrics that the candidates are assessed on in most subject areas, and they can get a maximum of 5 points for each of them. So I just want to give a little bit of background on the data that we're going to be discussing today. So the analysis that I did includes 3 cohorts of completers that we took from the analysis that we do with the teacher preparation report card. So that includes those who either completed their preparation program or were participating in a job embedded program and serving as a teacher of record in the 2013-14, 2014-15, and 2015-16 academic years. And with all the EdTPA scores, we're only using official Pearson scores for all of these completers. So we had originally had everybody self-report EdTPA scores, but just to make sure that we had the most accurate scores possible, we referred back to the Pearson scores and have all the scores that were submitted to Pearson for the state of Tennessee from 2013 through May of this year. And as a comparison, we also have a couple slides that refer to praxis information. These will include all test takers at Tennessee institutions for a given academic year, so it's not necessarily looking at exactly the same completers, but given that they're both surveying this across the state, we think that it's a fair comparison point. And then I just want to talk a little bit more about the specific EPPs whose data we're looking at here. So when EdTPA was allowed in Tennessee, there were 8 early implementing educator preparation providers. These were the TBR institutions, so Austin P, East Tennessee State, University of Memphis, Middle Tennessee State, and Tennessee Tech, as well as University of Tennessee Knoxville and Vanderbilt University. And so because these institutions had a little bit more time to implement EdTPA, some of them started with a specific program level or their undergraduate students or something like that and have gradually built up their implementation. So not all of these are going to be looking at the entire EPP's data for a given year, but by 2013-14, those 8 EPPs all had a significant portion of their completers taking the assessment. And about a year ago now, Amy and I scheduled some conversations to talk with them about this process. And we really found that the longer implementation period was something that they found really valuable. They were able to sort of analyze their scores as they got them back and make changes both to how they structured their courses in terms of when they were introducing EdTPA to their completers or different concepts that would be valuable to them, how they could integrate that into the curriculum. But we also found that they were able to institute specific supports for their completers based off of the areas they were able to see where they were struggling. As I mentioned, there are different rubrics that they can look at, so you can really see at sort of a granular level where your students are doing well, where they might be struggling, and where they could benefit from some additional support. So that's, I think, important context as we think about the new implementation at the rest of the EPPs, because really every EPP that we talked to of these 8 talked really highly about how helpful it was to have several years to be able to implement the EdTPA and sort of the iterative changes they were able to make to their program structure that helped them to really feel prepared as the 42 deadline is approaching for their completers to succeed on the assessment and then going on as teachers.
Why don't we pause there, Spencer, before we dig into the data, just to see if any of the members have questions about the EdTPA test itself, because like you mentioned sort of in opening, it is a really different kind of assessment than our Praxis 2 content assessments. It's much more of a portfolio-based, performance-based assessment that takes place over the course of multiple months during a candidate's student teaching, and it's more akin to the national board test and or sort of our team model evaluation once candidates are in the classroom. So I don't know, are there any questions that folks have for Spencer or others in the room about the test itself before we dig into the data?
Yeah, this is Bob. I've got a question. I somehow lost the WebEx, so I'm going to try and get back on it. But you said that there were 15 rubrics, and it's a note, obviously, that Tennessee is the highest in the nation, is 42. Are the scores 0 to 5? Or are they 1 to 5? And if so, is there a minimum in every one of the rubrics you have to have, or just a total of 42?
Amy Wooten, I think, has an answer for you on that from the department.
It is a total score. There is not a minimum on any individual rubric.
So it's cumulative across.
It is cumulative across, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions?
Yeah, this is Mike. The follow-up question is, should there be?
You know, I'm trying to remember. It's been a while since we had a deep dive on TPA from various, I think we had the woman from Scales, whose name I'm forgetting at the moment, Andrea dial in. But, you know, it might be as we approach January that we think about kind of doing a refresh on sort of some of the specifics around this, because I think that's a good question, Mike. And quite frankly, I could use sort of a reminder of sort of how some of this is being scored and what changes they have made, if any, as they've seen it sort of progress across states over the last couple of years.
And maybe it would be helpful to put some of the rubrics in their hands so that they could see. I think that the question is a good one. I don't think that it, you know, a lot of these things are tied together, and so if you are planning and, you know, you might, it's hard for me to just draw an example out of my head. That's why I think it might be good to actually have the rubrics in front of us.
Yeah.
But I think that the idea is it's unlikely that you would have one where you just fail miserably and do so great on all the other ones, because they are interconnected to one another. So I think that it would be
almost like domain scores on
it is. So you know, we have. But I think the question's worth asking for sure.
In terms of what thresholds there are, whether it's within the rubrics or across all rubrics together,
and
how the scoring is done.
TPA has a response to this as well, and so I think we could also get their response to that.
I'll make a note and we'll do some follow-up on specifics around scoring.
And I like Amy's suggestion that we have a copy of the rubrics in our hands. I think that would be very beneficial, as well as a refresher. But I also want to comment on what Spencer said, and I think it's important that we remember as we go through this presentation what those early adopters discovered as they were rolling out at TPA and the modifications that they could make along the way to get them to the point where they are today, if that makes sense. So I want to keep that in mind as we go forward.
Great. If there's no other questions, then Spencer, why don't you kind of walk us through this next round of data?
Yeah, so I have quite a bit of data here. I'll try to make it as comprehensible as possible, but I thought it would be best to start with a comparison of the pass rates for the TPA assessment compared to the Praxis PLT series. So for the 2013-14 cohort, which is the first one that we're looking at here, overall in the state of Tennessee, there was a 93.2% pass rate on the PLT assessments, which are divided into early childhood, K6, 5-9, and 7-12 grade bands. But for convenience, I've combined them all here, and there's not really any significant differences one to the other there. On the other hand, for TPA, at the minimum of 37 that we were using at the time, there was a 78.8% pass rate among the EPPs that we were looking at, and 69% of their completers would have passed if the qualifying score had been a 42 right off the bat. For the 14-15 cohort, Praxis pass rate, again, was comparable, 93.7%. We saw really dramatic increases even from the first to the second year at the 8 early implementing EPPs on the TPA, where 77.1% would have scored a passing score if we had used a 42 then, and 88.1% scored at least that minimum of 37. And then in 2015-16, Praxis was a little higher at just about 95%. And we really saw, again, pretty dramatic increases in terms of both the percent that would have passed at 42, which got up to 86.8, as well as the percent who did pass at 37, where we had 93.6% of completers passing. So really you could see that even by the third year, the pass rate at 42 was higher than the percentage that passed at the 37 rate for the first cohort there. And at 86.8% is already approaching sort of the pass rate that we have for the current screen that we use for pedagogical assessments in terms of the Praxis PLT.
So let's pause there for questions. This is Amy. One thing I'd like to point out, you know, we don't have any reason to suspect that the folks taking EdTPA in 2013-14 or 2014-15 were somehow, you know, less prepared to be teachers than the folks in 2015-16. It's a matter of how well their program had integrated the requirements of EdTPA and set expectations for it. And that's something that the program itself learned over time. So again, it's not a commentary necessarily that all those teachers in 2013-14 had something going on where they, weren't able to do as well because of some characteristic of their own. It's how well did your program prepare you and set you up for this. So that's really the point that we want to make here is that, over time as programs adjust to EdTPA and are able to prepare their students to meet the rigorous expectations, the students are able to meet that challenge, but it's not something that they're set up to do necessarily all on their own without their program wrapping around that support.
And I will also add that broadly across the 8 EPPs, we saw similar patterns where it wasn't just like we had more people taking it in later years. We really saw in the first year, pretty much everyone scored lower than they did in the third year by a pretty significant margin.
Did the rubrics requirements stay the same each 3 years, or did they change too?
Our understanding is that if they changed, it was very minimal, but that's another thing we'll double check on. I mean, I know EdTPA as an organization or sort of the sponsoring organization has been learning as they go, but I don't think, to my knowledge, there were any significant changes.
I don't think so.
I think actually before the 13-14 was when they had made the most
They-
significant
right.
changes. So within these 3 years, it was working within that new framework that they had established by that point. All right, so another piece of information we wanted to share to sort of contextualize those numbers was looking at the raw number of teachers that would not have passed or did not pass at the different qualifying score levels there. So with the 13-14 cohort, out of 1,325 total teachers who took the EdTPA at those 8 institutions, 411 teachers wouldn't have passed at a cut score of 42. And so in comparison to Praxis, where we have just about a 95% pass rate, that's a pretty significant amount. Whereas at the qualifying score of 37, there were 281 who either had to get remediation or were unable to get licensed because they were unable to pass this assessment. And so they might have taken the Praxis or not been able to teach. So in that first year, the difference in the number of teachers at the 2 qualifying scores here was 130. And so extrapolating that out to the entire state, that's a pretty significant number since this is just looking at 8 EPPs out of our 40. By 2014-15, there were 268 that wouldn't have passed at the cut score of 42 out of 1,172 teachers, as opposed to 139 who didn't get at least a 37. So both of those counts dropped pretty significantly from year 1 to year 2, but we're still seeing a difference of just under 130 teachers there that wouldn't have passed at the 42 that got at least a 37. And then by the third cohort that we're looking at for 2015-16, we were down to 149 out of 1,132 teachers who wouldn't have passed at 42, and 72 who didn't get that score of 37. So the difference did decrease a little bit there to 77 teachers who scored above a 37, but couldn't score that new qualifying score of 42. And so, beyond just looking at the pass rates and the number of teachers that wouldn't have passed, we thought it was helpful to provide some statistical analysis of how the teachers who did take EdTPA went on to do in the classroom. So as I mentioned, people who scored below a 37 were still able to submit either part or all of their assessment for remediation to get to a passing score there, or take the Praxis assessment, since at this time EdTPA wasn't a requirement and was just a substitute for the PLT assessments in Praxis. So we do have some teachers who were able to teach despite scoring below a 37 initially, as well as a number of teachers who met the current minimum of 37 but scored less than a 42. And then we've compared them to those who scored at least a 42, which is scheduled to become the new qualifying score. So in terms of observation, we do see an increase as a TPA score goes up in the first year observation score that teachers had once they enter the classroom. So those who scored below a 37 across the 3 cohorts had an average first year observation score of 3.3. Those who scored between a 37 and a 42 averaged a 3.33. And then those who scored at least a 42 averaged a 3.47. So that really aligns with what we've heard from the EPPs themselves in terms of TPA being a rigorous experience, but pretty well aligned with teams, so it prepares teachers well for how they'll be evaluated once they enter the classroom. So you can see that those who scored really highly on TPA did do well in terms of their observation scores. So that's part of why we're so excited to be implementing TPA and think that it's a real step in the right direction and a better assessment to use than Praxis. But we also found it really interesting looking at first-year TVOS scores of teachers in these different bands. So you can see that those who scored below a 37 had an average first-year TVOS score of just 2.32. So I think what that says to me is that that 37 qualifying score is really a good screen that candidates who score below a 37 might not necessarily be prepared to come into a classroom and help their students to learn at the level that we want them to. But we really don't see a huge difference on TVOS scores in terms of those who scored between 37 and 42 and those who scored over 42, as those who got at least a 37 had an average first-year TVOS score of 2.72, and those who scored over 42 were just at 2.75, so a pretty small difference there. And really, that's a stark pattern that I think is probably the most noteworthy thing that I found in my research here, is that it looks like on TVOS at least, the group that scored between 37 and 42 is fairly comparable to those who score above 42, but there's a significant difference between both of those groups and those who scored below a 37.
And building on what Spencer's saying, it might seem like we're making a big to-do over 0.4 points, but when you're on a 5-point scale, I mean, that's a significant percentage. That's about half a point. So that's why that is such an obvious signal to us that 37 and above, we're seeing something that we're not seeing at below 37.
When do you think we'll get 16, 17 numbers?
So for the completers specifically, we're working.
Well, for all of the data that we're looking at, it's 15, 16.
So we do have some current year data statewide that I'm going to be discussing later, but we're still doing the data collection for the 16-17 cohort of completers that we use for this analysis, since that's what's going to be going on the 2018 report card. So we're actually in the process of doing that right now, and I'll be speaking about that in I think 2 more sections. But yeah, we're working on getting that cohort, but I will share some more up-to-date data as well at the end of this.
Just your impression at that time as to whether this trajectory that we're seeing over the first 3 years appears to be continuing.
Mm-hmm.
For the most part, it does, and we'll get to that pretty quickly.
Okay.
And I assume you don't say it, you don't have the number of first-year scores here, but these numbers are statistically significant at 232 to 272.
Yes, that difference is, we had another comparison that looked at sort of whether passing or not passing was a statistically significant difference, and for TVOS, it was most significant at a passing score of 37, but statistically significant at other passing scores as well.
Okay.
And then the last thing I wanted to highlight on this slide is just, you can see that with placement rate, there does seem to be a pretty significant increase from one group to the next. So we can't say with certainty what's causing that necessarily, but we at least can see that teacher candidates who are scoring highly on the TPA do seem to be getting hired at higher rates. So whether districts are looking at that or whether TPA is just well correlated with other measures of what districts are looking for in a successful teacher, we do see that those candidates who are performing better on the TPA are more likely to be hired in their first year. So I think that gives us further confidence that this is a good assessment to be moving towards, and that it is something that is at least associated with what we're looking for in terms of a good teacher. So yeah, this next slide goes into a little bit what I was talking about with the analysis that I was doing for statistical significance before, but really we wanted to key in on TVOS here. So basically we have 2 different groups that we're looking at in each of these different rows. We're looking at, on the left, those who wouldn't have passed at a particular qualifying score, and then on the right column we have those who either did pass or would have passed at a particular qualifying score. So we looked at scores of 37, 40, and 42 to sort of see where we were seeing the biggest differences and where the most effective screen was in terms of a qualifying score. So at a passing score of 37, we saw that people who scored below that level had an average first-year TVOS score of 2.32, whereas those who scored above had a passing score or an average TVOS score in their first year of 2.75. And jumping ahead a little bit, you can see that no matter what we set as the qualifying score, the group of people who would have passed at that level is substantively similar, as all of them have an average TVOS score of 2.75. But again, what we really want to highlight here is that the biggest difference between not passing and passing is at that 37 level. At a passing score of 40, the average TVOS score of those who scored below the passing score was 2.41 versus 2.75 for those who scored above. And then at 42, we're seeing that the average score among all of those who scored below 42 was a 2.5 compared to a 2.75. So basically, the biggest screen that we're seeing is at that 37 level. And again, this just goes back to what I was trying to highlight before of how we really think that there are plenty of good teachers who in those first 3 years scored between a 37 and a 42, but were prepared to go into the classroom and help their students to learn at a level that we really feel comfortable with. All right, so another piece of information we wanted to bring in here just as another anchor comparison point is looking at some national data here. So for the 2013-14 cohort, the average EdTPA score across the United States was 44.3. In Tennessee, it was 43.6. And then this column on the right here, pass rate, shows at the score of 42 what the passing rate would have been. So in 2013-14, that's 72% of all teachers who took the EdTPA assessment scored a 42 or higher. Then in 2014-15, the national average was essentially the same at 44.2, and this is where Tennessee overcame that and has continued to be since then, where our average EdTPA score was 45.2 for those 8 ETPs in that year. Nationally, the pass rate would have been 71%. And then there was an uptick in 2015-16 where the national average score was 45, but again, the 8 ETPs that we looked at here in Tennessee had an average score of 47.2, so significantly above the national average. And nationwide, the pass rate would have been 75% there. So if you're comparing that to Praxis, it is pretty significantly lower across the nation in terms of the percentage of teachers who are achieving a 42 on this assessment.
Who's doing the best?
At the state level? Who's doing the best?
I don't know that EdTPA
No,
makes state level.
Yeah, which state has the highest average?
Yeah, I think EdTPA definitely releases sort of a national summary, but I don't believe that they make other states' average scores available. I'm not sure if we'd be able to get that information from them, but
I don't know that off the top of my head.
It's a throwaway question. I just don't worry.
yeah, sorry, I don't have that one on the top of our heads. All right, so another lens of this that I wanted to consider is that this subcommittee has focused quite a bit on teacher diversity, and in fact, my next presentation here is going to go into our efforts there a little bit. But we just wanted to keep that lens in mind as we're talking about our decision-making here. So we wanted to keep in mind the diversity implications of different qualifying scores on the EdTPA. So starting off, I wanted to just sort of give a summary here of how our white teachers do on the EdTPA versus our teachers of color. And I would like to highlight that the vast majority of people taking this assessment are white. Tennessee has a relatively white teacher force in general, but even more so in terms of the people who are actually taking the EdTPA assessment in these 3 cohorts. However, by combining all other races together, we're able to get at least a reasonable comparison there to look at and make sure that we're not necessarily negatively impacting teacher diversity with our decision-making on EdTPA. So in the 2013-14 cohort, we didn't see a very significant difference between how white teachers and teachers of color performed on the EdTPA. The median score for both white teachers and teachers of color in that year was a 44. The mean was a little bit higher for white teachers at 43.4 versus 43 for teachers of color, but again, not a particularly large difference in that first year. But then the pattern that sort of emerged is that both our white teachers and our teachers of color improved over time, but there was a more rapid increase for our white teachers. So by the 2014-15 cohort, their median had increased to 45, whereas teachers of color still had a median of 44, and the means had diverged a little bit more, where white teachers had an average score of 45.3, and teachers of color had improved to just 43.5. And then again, as we saw in some of the other data, there was again a pretty significant increase between the 2014-15 and 2015-16 cohorts. So the median for white teachers jumped all the way to 47 that year, and the median for teachers of color jumped to 46. And the mean scores there were 47.3 for white teachers and 45.6 for teachers of color. So again, we're seeing more of a difference there, but again, both groups moving in the right direction. And I think overall for the 3 years, the median score for both white teachers and teachers of color was a 45. So we're not seeing a huge reason to think that the EdTPA is in general biased against teachers of color, but we do want to make sure that our teachers of color are receiving the support that they need so that they can make the types of improvements that we saw our white teachers making in the first 3 years at these EPPs. And just to expand on that a little bit more, I looked at the different pass rates for white teachers and teachers of color at both the 37 level that we have now and the 42 qualifying score that we're scheduled to implement. So at the 42 level, 68.5% of white teachers would have passed in the 13-14 cohort, whereas 78.2% got at least a 37. And then again, as we saw with the mean scores, pass rates were fairly comparable for teachers of color, with 65.9% scoring at least a 42 and 77% passing at that 37 level. Then for 2014-15, we saw significant increases across the board, but again, more concentrated among our white teachers, where 77.7% scored above that 42 qualifying score and 88.5% qualified at the 37 level, whereas 68.6% of teachers of color had at least a 42 and 80% passed at the 37 level. And then again, we saw some significant increases with a little more convergence here at the 37 level at least, where 88.1% of white teachers got at least 42 and 94.5 got at least a 37, whereas 75.7% of teachers of color had a 42 or higher, and 88.3 were passing at the 37 level. So we're kind of seeing that at the 37 level, at least, we're able to converge a little bit more by 15-16, but the 42 still seems to be a barrier that would keep out a significant number of teachers of color and kind of work against some of the board's other efforts to make sure that we have a teacher force that's really diverse and representative.
And really a big takeaway there is that candidates of all races are having high average scores. They're doing well and they're well prepared to be solid novice teachers. It's just that, you know, as Spencer said, the percent of people not passing seems like it might vary in ways that put teachers of color at a disadvantage, and we want to be sensitive to that as we're making any policy decisions moving forward.
So, Mike, yeah, this is where we get to some of the more current data. Between August 2017 and May 2018, we checked, I think, at the end of last month, there were 2,359 total EdTPA submissions, and that includes all of our EPPs reporting for the state, as well as people who might have come from out of state or were unaffiliated with an EPP who took the EdTPA assessment. Overall, we had 32 EPPs who had at least one submission and 8 who still haven't had any. So with that in mind, we have had a lot more people at least beginning the implementation process prior to the deadline of January, but we still have a number of EPPs who haven't, and as you'll see in a little bit, there's evidence that not everyone at the EPPs who have started implementing EdTPA is taking it yet. At the 37 qualifying score that we have in place now, overall, Tennessee EPPs had a 90% pass rate, so sort of, as I mentioned before, continuing the positive trend there. And 79.6% would have passed at a qualifying score of 42. So again, we're seeing pretty significant increases in terms of overall levels of pass rates there. But I do want to note that something that you'll see in, I believe, the next slide is that there's a pretty significant difference between that group of 8 early implementers that we've been looking at so far and the other institutions that have started to implement EdTPA.
So what's the deal on the 8 that didn't submit?
So they weren't required to last year, so I think some of them are either still in the planning process or just haven't had any candidates who have actually submitted their TPA assessments yet. I'll pass that off to the department to see if you guys have any more specific information about those 8.
I think you're right, Spencer, that there are in fact some providers that have not engaged with EdTPA. I think we find that concerning. We have monthly EdTPA calls for that all of our providers are welcome to attend, and in addition to that, we have had lots of support from evaluation services across the state in providing lots of opportunities for training. Many of our providers who have been implementing EdTPA for years have offered support to other EPPs. And in addition to that, the state offered, through evaluation services, offered vouchers for EdTPA candidates. So I think it is concerning that we have a set of providers that haven't yet submitted. I do think among that 8, there may be a few who actually did submit portfolios late in the spring this year, and we may not have scores back for them yet, but I don't want to overstate that. I think that could be 1 or 2 providers. I think one of the things that we will do, we being the department will do, will be to reach out directly to each of these 8 providers just to have a call with them to, make sure they're aware and make sure that we understand if there's a challenge or barrier that we can help them between now and January.
So from what we've seen, the longer you have been working the EdTPA program, the better your scores become. So if 8 of these or a number of these hadn't even started yet, we got to decide what we're going to do with them.
Yeah, and like this is Sarah, but that'll lead to the conversation about sort of where we are with our policy come January 2019, because you're exactly right. I mean, all programs across the state, whether they were early adopters or not, per our policy are required to use the EdTPA starting in January of 2019. So I think it's got to be sort of probably a multi-pronged approach of following up with those institutions to see, why they haven't engaged and what they're planning to do, and then also thinking about what we feel is appropriate in terms of expectations for the assessment.
And we're about a slide and a half away from that, so we'll be getting into the discussion in just a moment.
All right, take us home, Spencer.
Yeah, so the last real thing I wanted to share in terms of our data is sort of a comparison between those 8 early implementers and the later implementers within that 17-18 data that we were able to share. So starting off, I think the first column there is pretty relevant in that we had 1,178 completers at the 8 EPPs that we've been looking at for this whole presentation who have been in the process of implementing EdTPA and revising their course structures and everything based on it, whereas among all the other EPPs that have started implementing EdTPA, there are only 544 candidates. So I think statewide, we're still expecting there to be a pretty big jump next year in terms of the number of submissions that we get as this becomes required for everyone. And I think a big part of that is, as I mentioned with the 8 early implementers, I think a number of EPPs who are implementing now have taken the opportunity to sort of phase this in either by program area or by degree level or that sort of thing as well. So I think we'll still be expecting a pretty significant jump there from the EPPs that are just beginning this process now. But I think the rest of the information is relevant as well. With mean score, I was encouraged to see that there wasn't a huge difference there. The early implementers had an average score of 47.6 this year, so again, continuing that positive trend that we saw. And the later implementers had a score of 46.5, so significantly higher than the first year of what we were looking at in terms of the 8 early implementers. But again, this might be in part because the EPPs have phased in programs that they feel more confident in or something like that in the early years before it's a requirement. And so we do see a little bit more divergence in terms of passing rate. So at the 37 passing rate, we didn't see anything that was too problematic. 95.4% of our early implementers were passing at a 37, which is even above the statewide praxis passing rate. So I think we're really encouraged by that. And even among the later implementers, there was still a passing rate of 85.1 at the current 37 level. But we do see a pretty strong difference at 42, where 84.6% of the early implementers were passing at that level, whereas only 68.9% of the later implementers, which I think is just about equivalent to the percent that scored at least a 42 in the 13-14 cohort at the 8 that we've been looking at so far. So we do see some encouraging signs in the later implementers, but I think it is important to break that out so that we're not looking at just the statewide averages there, because I really do think that the EPPs that we talked to benefited a lot from having a couple of years to work up to a 42 average and make curricular changes or offer different supports to their candidates. And so I think that's important to keep in mind as we move to the next slide and sort of begin considering our options here. So moving beyond Tennessee, I wanted to share a little bit of information about sort of comparison states. So looking at our 8 border states, there are only 3 that have already implemented EdTPA, and I believe North Carolina is in the process of working on that this summer. Alabama and Arkansas have qualifying scores of 37, like what we have currently. And Georgia, I believe just this year increased from, they had previously used a 35 and now are using a 38 qualifying score moving forward. And then looking at things a little more broadly, I found a couple examples of states who had done interesting things or had implementation strategies that I thought were relevant to our discussion here. So Illinois, when they adopted EdTPA statewide, had included from the very beginning what they called a ramp up, which is basically incrementally increasing their qualifying score from 35, which they started at in 2015, to in 2019, they'll move up to a 41, which is the highest that any state currently has. Sort of on the other hand, New York had initially implemented a qualifying score of 41, but after some pretty significant backlash and seeing the effect that qualifying score had on teacher shortages, they've actually lowered their qualifying score to a 38 for the 2018-19 academic year. But they do have plans to increase that by a point every couple of years to eventually get back up to a 40 by 2022. So I think those 2 states offer sort of alternatives for what we could do here based off of the data if we do have concerns about implementing a 42 cut score this January. And so that kind of leads into the 4 options that we've identified here in terms of where the state board can go in this policy. So I think based off of earlier discussions that we've had and then conversations that the staff have had internally, we feel comfortable with making EdTPA a statewide requirement on January 1st. We don't want to delay that. And we do, as I mentioned, really see that EdTPA is well aligned with team and preparing teachers well to be evaluated in the classroom, and that it's at least associated with higher placement rates. So it's at least related to the traits that our districts are looking for in terms of a quality teacher, if not something that they're directly looking at really statewide yet. But within that framework, we have a couple different options of how we can handle things. So option 1 is sort of just to leave things the way that they are right now. So the current policy would go into effect on January 1st, 2019, and then candidates would have to obtain a qualifying score of 42 or higher in order to receive their license, and that would again be the highest qualifying score on EdTPA in the nation. The second option that we've identified is just basically delaying when we'll make the jump from 37 to 42. So we could keep 37 as the qualifying score either for another year or 2 years, something like that, and then have 42 become the qualifying score in either 2020 or 2021. Sort of along that same spectrum, we could also keep the qualifying score at 37 for next year, but build in our own ramp up like Illinois has, or incrementally increase either by a couple of points a year or add a point between 37 and 42, or we think that it would be valuable to have a qualifying score between those 2 points for a certain amount of time. but basically schedule increases so that we could get to 42, but not have that come into effect on January 1st. And then beyond all of those options, I think we're also open to discussing whether we think 42 might not be the right qualifying score for the state, or whether we want to significantly alter the timeline beyond just a couple of years to get people up to the level that we think that is necessary there. So at this point, I think we're ready to open things up to discussion. If you have any questions about any of the data that I've shared or anything else, I'm happy to jump in. But I think it would be really helpful to hear all of your thoughts on these different options and where we go from here.
And sorry if you mentioned
And
this.
so this is Lillian. Before we get into that discussion, I want to thank you for the hard work that you put into preparing these materials for us, because to have this analysis, to have these comparisons, and to look at the implications to diversity, I think it's critically important that we have this data. So I thank you so much for providing it, because now I think we can make a more informed decision as we look at options, because we know the intention is to, based on what we determined today, we're going to present this in workshop to the rest of the board. That's my understanding from what we've talked about in the past. So thank you so much, because this has been hugely helpful to me personally, and I would hope that Mike feels the same way. I'm sure he does, and Bob joining us today. So I'll let anybody else jump in and begin thinking about the options and what they would like to do going forward before I say what I think. But thank you, Spencer.
This is Bob. I do have a question. In looking at these options, do you have feedback from districts on what they prefer? I mean, what I see here is a challenge between maintaining or getting the highest quality teacher we can get versus meeting the immediate needs of the districts. And we have district feedback on this.
Bob, I think you hit the nail on the head, where districts are trying to strike that balance of we want people who are high quality, we want folks who are coming in ready to teach the way we expect with the team rubric, but we also need people who are able to be in those classrooms. We don't want to be doing, getting people who are on some sort of emergency or short-term license or anything like that, or a long-term sub. So I think that the district balance would be that we need teachers who've gone through our prep programs who are ready to teach, and we don't want to have something like, the program not being prepared to implement EdTPA be something that then creates a barrier for otherwise qualified teachers to enter the classroom.
This is Sarah. Just one other thing to add, Bob. You'll see this as you join the advisory council on the teacher prep report card, but that's one place where we have talked some about EdTPA, and I know district representatives have been encouraging of this model of a performance assessment because it is so much more similar to what the teachers experience through the team evaluation. We don't have extensive sort of feedback from districts on the cut score conversation, though.
Can I jump in?
Yes.
This is Amy Wooten. I have had feedback from our ed prep providers, and I think that they are concerned. And particularly, I've had conversations with new or recent adopters who have been very serious about the process, not delaying or pushing back against it, but just have really embraced it, but have expressed concerns about moving to the 42 in January. I think they agree that they want us in Tennessee to have very high expectations, but I think they would feel that there would be a benefit from having more time especially for these new providers. And I think all the data that Spencer shared backs this up, but I have had that feedback directly from our ed prep community. And I would say that for those providers that have been implementing a long time, they also endorse that. They say it did take them quite a while to fully integrate EdTPA into their program.
And Amy, tell me if I'm putting words in your mouth, but the conversations I've had with providers, EPPs, have also been very much validating and encouraging of the test itself. But while they recognize the learning curve, they really have appreciated, I think, the depth.
For the most part.
Yeah.
I'm gonna remove.
Certainly nobody's a singular opinion on everything,
but particularly related to special education. Okay. And I had an exchange with one of my favorite special education faculty members recently, and she reminded me of that. That is a place where we should still be asking the question of, is this, our professional assessments are, not perfect instruments, and we should always be considering how they're working for us.
Different groups of
But
teachers.
anyway,
And
I do think there's broad support for EdTPA though.
And with special education, I believe that that's also a nationwide concern, that
Yeah.
EdTPA is
I have heard
working
that.
on that
Yeah.
assessment because of concerns. And the last thing I'd add is just that I think we feel that even at a 37, that the EdTPA is at least as strong of an indicator of pedagogy as the current praxis assessment. So it's not like we'd be taking a step backward even if we
No,
kept
I
it
think
at a
we could go on
37.
record saying it's probably stronger because
Yes.
it's more reflective
Yes.
and more authentic
Yes.
measure of pedagogical skills and content applied in pedagogy.
Yes.
So I've talked to, I think, 5 EPs, and what Amy Wooten said, and you, Sarah, none of them are pushing back. None of them are talking about sandbagging. They're the ones I've talked to. But they genuinely feel that they can make the mark, but they need more time. And I get the sense that they're not really looking for a huge block of time, that they, and that it could be feathered upward. And the question, if we agree with that, is I personally don't believe we ought to back away from 42. It is set a hard time for that for the state to meet the 40. In other words, push it back.
Mhm.
And I'm thinking somewhere between 1 and 2 years. I'm not thinking 8 years.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And this is Lillian. I think we should keep 42 as well, and I would like to see data after the first year to determine how quickly are they moving toward that 42, as opposed to saying today we think it could be 1 year, maybe it is 2 years. So I agree with what Mike is saying at the bottom line.
And that's the bottom line.
I just wouldn't want them to think that if we go slow in improvement, that we're going to calibrate it, the movement slowly. They're going to, I mean, there's a reason why we're moving away from praxis. And this has not been a rapid process in the first place. But I do think that a whole lot of these smaller colleges especially need some time. And I think they're going to hit it. I think they're going to make it.
And let me clarify the reason I asked the question is I concur that, I fully believe that we ought to have the strongest, highest quality program we can have, and having the highest in the nation, I think, is good for Tennessee. But again, it's something that does require time. You just can't, edict it today and have it tomorrow. I mean, you need a good, logical approach in how you do that. So.
Okay, so I think I'm hearing from all three of you a preference to keep the cut score at 42, to delay it at least 1 year, potentially 2, and to see some sort of data along the way on how fast programs are moving toward kind of a higher or more similar pass rate at the 42. Is that correct?
Amy, that's exactly what I'm thinking.
So
I agree.
This is Sarah. The only thing I would add to that, again, is that, right now our policy is set to take effect in January at a score of 42. So we'll need to think about what we propose, we being, again, the state board and the department, to the full board in July. What does that look like? Is it saying that, we're staying with a cut score of 42, but for 2019 we're going to raise it, we're going to say it's a 37, or are we going to say it's a 39? What specifically are we requiring in the next year for candidates? So I don't know if
This
you'll
is
have
Lillian.
thoughts.
I'm looking at option 3, qualifying score remaining at 37 with incremental increases up to the qualifying score of 42. Something along those lines, maybe a little bit of tweaking of the language, but that's what I was thinking based on all the data and what we've heard from the EPPs.
So stay with the 37 for the 2019 year.
That's my opinion.
And to be able, Lillian, I think something that is appealing to me, and obviously I defer to you all, this is Amy Owen, but the idea of having ed prep programs and candidates be able to prepare in advance, so being able to say this July, that we know in 2019 the score will be 37, in 2020 it'll be this, in 2021 it'll be that, rather than maybe saying it's going to be 37 for another year, then we'll see how it's going, maybe we'll change it, maybe we won't.
I would agree with that, Amy, because I think we, as a board, can always revisit each year if the data is concerning, but it would give some urgency and push people towards a timeline that is still working towards a 42.
I think that.
How long has it been at 37?
Last 3 years?
Well, but it's only
been an option. Right, it's been an option,
It's not
not
been
required.
required.
But while it's been an option,
It's been optional, but you've known that you've had to have it required coming down the pike, right?
Correct.
yes.
I might be inclined to bump it up a little bit. I mean, I think you want to get to 42, but I don't think you want to. I think I agree with Mike. You don't want to wait a slow process. I might be inclined to bump it up, show a path to 42, and it's been at 37 for 3 years. I might go to 38 or 39 next year. Just a thought.
But the only problem with that, from my perspective, is that this is just being rolled out for the majority of the EPPs in January. So they've not been, and correct me if I'm wrong, and I might not be stating this correctly, I don't think that the vast majority have been rolled out yet. So to put them under the pressure to start out of the gate at a higher level than 37, I don't think is the right approach. That's, again, one person's opinion. And yes, the 8 that have been out there, they certainly are above that. But we're talking about the others.
Remind me, did they know this was coming and they chose just not to start the program until last year? Or
No, it was in our presentation.
or were these 8 that were, or 11 or whatever that were doing TPA, doing it on their own anyway, and they just had in other words, the ones who are just now starting as of last year, did they have prior notice that this was coming their way?
So, Mike, in October 2016, the board passed the update to the professional assessments policy requiring EdTPA on January 1, 2019. So that was October of 2016.
We've got that slide up on the
Yes.
WebEx as well, right?
Yes, we had that slide at the start, but it's a good reminder. The 6 Tennessee Board of Regents institutes kind of decided as a block at that time that they wanted to be early implementers and start this sooner than later, as did UT Knoxville and Vanderbilt. Other programs have been phasing it in their own ways. They've been maybe in planning stages or getting ready for programmatic changes, but those were the 8 who said, we're going to start this. They actually even started it sooner when some flexibility was added to say you can do this as an option even before the requirement was set forth.
So, in my mind, if they're just newbies, it is because they chose to be.
Well, Mike, I want to.
PBR required it at their schools. Isn't that right?
Yeah,
Early on.
but I think that, and Michael Derline just mentioned this. I don't know if you caught it, but Evaluation Services recommends a 3 to 4 year implementation strategy. And so if we look back at October 2016, we're not even 2 years out from that yet. So, getting ready to implement, even if we haven't seen movement, doesn't mean that they haven't been, thinking about how to integrate it into their coursework and doing some of those things. So
yeah, I've gone to the statewide EdTPA conference the last couple of years, and pretty much all the EPPs were there trying to learn about it, but
Right.
it is a lot to try to figure out how to prepare your students best for. So
The data that you provided is only for those 8 schools, or is it for more schools?
for the first 3 cohorts that we were looking at from 13-14, 14-15, and 15-16, but then those 2 slides about the 17-18 data that we have look at the entire state as of right now.
Which includes some adopters who are just coming online. So here's one
The
thought.
vast majority majority of the data is from the early adopters, the 8 that launched
That's right.
3 years
The
ago.
trend lines that we're seeing in terms of the increases each year are the early adopters. And again, I think that was in part driven by TBR's requirement for their institutions. That was some of the schools at least. But here's one thought. Amy Wooten and I were kind of just back of the envelope. I mean, we could keep at a 37 for the first year at 2019 or potentially go up to 38. But then from there, increase 2 points each year. So 2020, we'd be at a 39, 2021 at a 41, and then by 1 more point to get to 42 by 2022. But I feel like if we did something like that where we lay it out for programs so they know we're going to a 42 and there's a definitive timeline, and then we can still, as a board, revisit each year if we want, certainly you could change it and go faster, but you certainly could go a little slower if you needed to, but that would kind of point directionally that we're headed for a 42, and we could report out each year, like Spencer has done with the data this year, how many candidates would have passed it to 42 and share that with our programs to create additional incentive for them to be working fast to get there. But that's one way you could approach it if you wanted to do kind of an incremental ramp up over the next, 3 or 4 years.
Sarah, I really think that our option would be, in reality, that we could go slower. I don't see, once we set a timeline going forward as a ramp up, that we can escalate that. I think there would be.
I agree. So we could, if you wanted, we could go more aggressive on what we put out first, and then, I would totally agree, Mike. I think you're right. It's possible to go slower, but probably not faster once you put it out there. So feel free to take that and tweak it. I mean, we could get to 42 faster than 2022 to that point, Mike, or,
And y'all, this will just be on first reading in July, so we'll have an opportunity for the full board to weigh in and to provide feedback to the department before final in October. Is there anything else that folks wanted to say specifically on EdTPA at this time?
Because we can also, I know we're over time on this particular topic, but we can also discuss offline via email or phone calls with each of you individually, and maybe that would be good just to kind of nail down sort of what language and what timeline specifically. If it does seem like you all are of the opinion that we should put it in writing to get to 42 over the next couple of years, we can kind of work together to see what that looks like exactly in terms of how aggressive to go.
That works for me. Are you okay with that?
Yeah, I really want to reiterate that of the 5 colleges I talked to, they are they're ready to. They're in the process of doing this. They just don't think they can get there in the time that we have it, but they're serious about it. They're not trying to get out of anything. So I'm impressed with them. After talking to them, I understand why they need more time. It's just a question of how much time and how we structure it.
Well,
they're trying.
They are, and we appreciate that insight that you've been able to get from talking to the programs in your area, Mike. I think it's been really useful to shape this conversation. We're going to shift gears and move kind of rapidly through our last couple presentations. We're going to skim through the diversity one because it's actually something we'll talk about again in September and with the full board in October. So Spencer's going to keep this pretty high level and moving along, but we're happy, as Sarah said, have follow-up conversations with you. This is really just kind of the taste of the research that's out there about the importance of teacher diversity both nationally and in Tennessee.
Yeah, so I believe we've got this slide up now, but basically there's really a convincing body of research that it's important to have a diverse teacher force, and in particular for students of color to have teachers of color teaching them and for them to be able to see them as role models and to experience the way that they're able to be educated. So we've got 4 different studies here. One of them looks at the impact of having a same-race teacher on test scores, and I believe in both math and reading, there was significantly higher test scores for students when they had a teacher of the same race. We also are able to see that students with demographically similar teachers have overall more positive experiences at school and are more likely to want to attend college. We're also seeing that greater teacher diversity is linked to decreased use of exclusionary disciplines, so being suspended or expelled or basically kept out of the classroom where you're able to learn, as well as greater rates of identification for gifted programming and lower rates of sort of disproportionately being directed towards special education programming. And then finally, there was a study that came out last year that showed that being taught by even one same-race teacher significantly decreases the dropout rate for Black students in particular, and really there was a substantial benefit for Black male students. So that's sort of the research background for some of the stuff that we've been doing, but we've also been working on putting together a follow-up to the report card specifically on teacher diversity, so we've done a little bit of our own research there as well, and I wanted to share the initial results of that with you today. So this comes in the context of certain groups like the Trailblazer Coalition, which is a group of Middle Tennessee EPPs who are really focused on teacher diversity and put out a great report last year that we can share with you if you'd like, as well as groups like Conexión Americas who have consistently been working on this as a goal. But we really have started to do our own internal research, again, looking at some of the data we collected for the 13-14, 14-15, and 15-16 cohorts for the report card. And so one thing that I'd like to note here, because I'm going to have to go through the actual data pretty quickly, is that a lot of our analysis, we use statistical controls to compare students or teachers to people from the same EPP. So that way you're getting more of an indicator of how each EPP prepares students relatively, rather than potentially just seeing the effects of different types of teachers being prepared by different EPPs.
So for example, this would be comparing students who went to, say, MTSU to other students who went to MTSU, rather than all students who went to MTSU in comparison to students from some other institution.
So the first thing we looked at there was how TIVA scores differed by race. We actually were able to see that our Asian teachers and our Hispanic teachers scored statistically significantly higher than our white teachers on TIVAS. But using the statistical controls, we saw that compared to institutions or individuals from the same institution, this effect was less pronounced. And then Black and multiracial teachers, we did see scored a little bit lower than other teachers, but the differences there weren't statistically significant. So partly that's because we just don't have huge sample sizes there in terms of the number of teachers, but we do want to keep that in mind. And then with observation scores, we saw similarly that our Black teachers score a little bit lower, and some evidence of this happening with multiracial students. And this was actually a little bit more pronounced when compared to other teachers from the same institution. So I think that's something that we want to keep in mind and make sure that the evaluation process is as fair as possible to teachers of all races. But the difference there in observation scores was about 0.08 points, so less than a tenth of a point on the 5-point team scale, so not a hugely alarming difference there. One of the more interesting things that we found was that teachers of color are both placed and retained at statistically significantly higher rates than white teachers. So with placement, the gap is the largest, with 74.1% of the teachers of color that we looked at being placed in their first year at a Tennessee public school classroom, as opposed to 66.5% of our white teachers. And breaking this down a little bit further, we saw that Hispanic teachers were placed at similar rates as white teachers and retained as well, I believe. But Black teachers were really placed at significantly higher rates, 13.1% higher overall, and even 7% higher than others at their same EPPs. And again, this was more pronounced among Black male teachers, who were placed at 15% higher rates than other teachers and 10% higher than other teachers coming from the same EPP. So we're really seeing that there is a large demand for teachers of color in our districts. They want to be able to hire these teachers. So that's something that we've really found important as we're trying to make sure that our prep programs are doing the best that they can to prepare teachers of color, so that way these districts can hire them and make sure that the students that we have in Tennessee, as the state grows increasingly diverse, have teachers who match them demographically. And so some other work that we've been doing is kind of looking at how we are promoting this in terms of the teacher preparation report card. So right now we just look at the percentage of teachers at each EPP that are teachers of color, and we're seeing that it's pretty significantly lower than the percentage of Tennessee students who are non-white, but we wanted to make sure that we were calculating this as fairly as we could, because we've heard some complaints from our EPPs that those in more rural areas or just generally whiter areas have a different student population that they're drawing from there. So we wanted to see if there was a better way to assess how well we're doing in terms of diversity at the EPP level. So one thing that we looked at was sort of comparing the demographics of the teachers coming out of an EPP to the students that they're teaching. So we started off by looking at either their top 3 or their top 5 districts in terms of where they're sending the most teachers. But then what I found most helpful, and this is a little bit difficult to explain, so feel free to ask me a question if I'm not clear about this. But basically what we did was we created a composite district looking at all the teachers that an EPP sent out, and then weighting the demographics of those district students by the number of teachers that they sent there. So for an EPP, if they sent 50 teachers to Shelby County and 5 teachers to one of the less diverse suburban districts there, we're looking at a student population that's pretty significantly more diverse than you would get just by averaging each district the same way. But basically we wanted to weight it by the number of teachers going to each district. So looking at the demographics of the students that EPP completers are actually teaching. But
Okay,
basically,
so
yeah.
let me so we're looking at an EPP population and where they get jobs.
Mm-hmm.
Don't we need to look at the population of the college and where they're getting their students?
So right now we do have on the report card our disaggregation for the racial diversity metric looks at the percentage of the undergraduate student body that's students of color, so that way we can at least see how well they do in that context and whether their education program is as diverse as the student body as a whole. But this was more sort of in the context of seeing all the benefits that come from having teachers of color teaching students of color and white students as well. But this is sort of the rationale there.
And Mike, you're right, this is kind of a judgment call. There's a couple different ways to approach it. Given that the report card, we do try as much as possible to focus on outcomes of programs. One outcome is where are your teachers going to teach, and are they at least as diverse as the student bodies in those districts? I think that, you know, we can continue to look at ways to calculate this metric. I think that the one we went with really aligns philosophically with what we're trying to do with the report card in terms of the diversity metric. But you're absolutely right. We've heard from programs that said, you know, in general, we recruit from sort of this area and there's not a lot of diversity there. I think that some programs have also gotten really creative with their recruitment strategies to recruit potential teacher candidates of color from outside their typical sort of catchment area. And that's something that we want to highlight in a follow-up report that we're going to talk about in just a minute.
So looking at that metric and sort of the weighted demographics of the students that our EPPs are teaching, a few of the smaller EPPs did score more highly on this. Some of the ones that might be from less diverse areas but have done at least a reasonable job of recruiting teachers of color. And we also saw that in the Memphis area, given the significant diversity there, that some of the EPPs that look pretty good, just looking at the raw percentage numbers there, don't fare quite as well. But in general, what struck us the most was just that pretty much nowhere is doing a very good job of making sure that their teachers are as diverse as the students they go on to teach. In fact, Tennessee State was the only EPP whose teacher demographics were at least half as diverse as the students that they're going on to teach. So I think that encourages us to continue to push on this issue and to make sure that we're doing more to promote teacher diversity and sort of highlighting the best practices that we're seeing and sort of encouraging EPPs to move beyond some of the, I don't want to say excuses, but excuses that they had for why they haven't done more in the past. And so that's why we've sort of shifted to hoping to produce a follow-up report specifically focusing on teacher diversity as something related to the report card and something that'll keep people considering teacher prep beyond just our February launch date. But we really see this as a good starting point to kind of sink our teeth into this issue and really make sure that we're doing the most we can at the state level here.
And the last slide on teacher diversity is just kind of a heads up of actions you'll see coming from the board staff for your consideration over the next few months on things we can do at the state board to support increased teacher diversity. One thing I think it's important to note, you know, this isn't a zero-sum game. We have a shortage of teachers statewide. We would encourage ed prep programs to continue having as many qualified candidates as they can of any race or ethnicity, right? It's that we need more teachers in general, and we also need more teachers of color. So I think that's important to keep in mind. As you can see,
I agree with exactly what you just said. I would add male teachers, particularly male teachers of color, is a sudden shortage. Part of what we need to do in these months to come, I agree with everything that we've seen so far over the years, in the months recently, and in this report. We've got to figure out how to do it, and it's not going to be just us, or it can't just be the EEPs. We're going to have to EPPs. We're going to have to figure out how to get kids interested in teaching who we want to be interested in teaching at an early age. And we're going to have to figure out an incentive for them to do it. And that's going to take a whole lot of people, both public and private sector.
Yep.
Well, and I agree with you, Mike. I know we're getting so out of time here, but we're working on that very topic here with counties that I have an opportunity to work closely with, because the districts have to do their part. And there are teachers who discourage students from becoming teachers. There is societal, there's family. There's a whole lot of factors where individuals are discouraged from going into the profession. So we're trying to look at it from a holistic approach with 6 school districts that I work with. But yes, across the spectrum, a vast amount of work has to be done, because the EPPs cannot do it by themselves.
we definitely agree, Lillian. And you'll see, you can read that slide for yourself. We'll talk about this more in September. We do actually have a rule on the books from 1994 that aligns with state law on encouraging the recruitment and hiring of African American teachers. It's very permissive that districts are encouraged to do this, but we want to bring that a revision in October to update that language and maybe to provide some more suggestions or recommendations on how districts, ed prep programs, and others can support that effort. So with that, I'm going to let Spencer fly through a quick update on the report card, and then we'll turn it over to the DOE for some fast hits as well.
Yep, I probably won't even explain everything on the slides, but the information should be all there. If you have any questions, let me know. Basically, we did data collection a little bit differently for the report card this year, and we sent out pre-populated completer files in partnership with the department. So right now, all of our EPPs are looking at those, and by the end of the month, they'll submit the rest of the data that we need for that. By September 1st, we hope to have a fully finalized completer file for the report card and the annual reports this year. And then the other major update there is that we are putting together our advisory council this year for what we expect to be 3 meetings in the summer and the fall. We'll talk about changes for the 2018-19 report card, or 2018 report card, sorry, larger plans for a bigger redesign in 2019, and then ways that we can go beyond just that launch date with things like the diversity follow-up report. We've got a mix of new and returning members, and one of our new members this year is Bob Eby, who will be serving as the state board representative. So Bob, we're really grateful to have you there, and we're looking forward to those conversations as well.
Looking forward to it. Thank you.
All right, we're going to turn it over to Amy and Michael from the department to give us a few additional updates. And if you all are good to go over just a couple minutes, we may end up being a couple minutes over 11, but we'll do our best here to give you the salient information quickly. Amy.
Great. So quickly, I just want to share with you, I know that Lillian already knows this, but I have accepted a new position with Deans for Impact, and this Friday is my last day with the department. There are a lot of mixed emotions about that, but Michael Derline will be stepping into my role, and he is fantastic, as you know well, and I have no doubt that he will do an amazing job continuing to lead this office and this work for the department.
And I can't resist stepping in for just a quick second because this is, it's a major loss for the state to lose Amy. We're excited for her next step, and I think Deans for Impact will really benefit from the experience that she's had in Tennessee and the work that she's done. But I have to say, I was the one that got the pleasure of hiring Amy back in the day, and then together we got to hire Michael. So I've worked closely with both of them, both at the department and now at the state board. And Michael will do a tremendous job stepping into Amy's role. He's been working side by side with her for years now. And that's not to say at all that we're not going to miss Amy terribly, because we will. And we don't have time for me to go into how much gratitude we have for the work that you've done. But yes, you will be very much missed.
Well, I'll be in Nashville.
Congratulations, Amy.
Thank you, Mike. You're not going to get rid of me.
Yes, and I echo comments in the essence of time, ditto.
Thank you. Thank you, Lillian.
Thank you.
Likewise.
So quickly, I want to share with you a little bit of an update. As you may recall, we are in the midst of implementing a requirement that all of our early elementary and special education programs submit proposals related to new literacy standards. So I just wanted to give you a quick update on where we are with that. We have had 112 proposals submitted for the first round of review. Of those proposals, 33 met expectations. 31 were close to meeting expectations and need minor revisions, and 40 will require substantial revisions. Providers have received that feedback, and I do want to say that we were able to recruit and train 22 reviewers for this process, and so we really shifted the way that we conduct these types of review, and the feedback that they got was substantive and designed to really help support the providers in understanding how to better align their programs with the standards. So we're very excited about that process. So as I mentioned, we've completed the first review. The second round of revisions will be due on June 30th, and so we will provide you with another update on where we are with those results after that. In terms of annual reports, I'll just speak really quickly to that. I think everything that Spencer mentioned, we've begun the data collection process, and we're looking forward to continuing to improve our annual reporting. This year, for the first time, we were able to generate a set of data for ed prep providers from TN Compass, which is our online licensure system, that hopefully begins to reduce the burden on our providers in terms of the data collection process for both annual reporting and report cards. So we're excited about that. Michael's going to talk about leader preparation, and I expect he'll mention what we're going to do with annual reports for leader prep. The only other item that I wanted to bring to your attention is related to the professional assessments policy. I want to quickly just highlight for you a few recommendations that we're going to bring to the board in July. Michael's told me also that I'm no longer allowed to say we.
Please enter your PIN followed by the pound or hash. If you do not know your PIN, please enter pound or hash.
Hello? Can you still hear us?
Did we lose you?
Uh-oh.
Thank you.
Hello?
Hello?
Hey,
Can you still hear
you're
us?
there, but they're not.
Okay,
Okay,
we're back.
Again?
I'm not sure what happened.
Okay.
What did you miss any of what Amy was saying?
Yes, just the last, when she started to talk about professional assessments.
Okay, great. So in July, we'll bring an item for professional assessments, and I'm going to quickly review for you the changes that will be on that item. First of all, there are a set of world languages for which Praxis does not offer an exam, and we have worked collaboratively with the content teams at the department to examine some assessment options that are available through the Tennessee Foreign Language Institute. And so we are going to be recommending some new assessments in areas like Japanese and Arabic that we haven't had before, and so we're excited about that. In addition, there's ETS has regenerated their computer science assessment, so we'll be adding that assessment to the professional assessments policy. The same is true of the school leader licensure assessment. So those are the fairly straightforward, easy ones. Middle grade math, we've discussed this in the past, and you may recall that the determination of the task force that took a look at this, thank you to the board for convening that task force, was that the Pearson assessment should be should replace our current Praxis math assessment, and so we will introduce the Pearson assessment onto the professional assessments policy now with a phase out likely of approximately a year that we would continue to accept the ETS Praxis.
In addition, for secondary math, we are going to recommend the addition of the Pearson secondary math assessment. We are not going to drop the praxis assessment. We're going to allow candidates to have a choice of which one that they take. You may recall that the secondary math praxis, one of the biggest criticisms that we hear from districts is that it is overly rigorous in ways that are not aligned with our student standards, and so many teachers who would be effective, especially in teaching Algebra 1, Algebra 2, and some of those lower level math classes are really struggle to pass that test. The task force that reviewed the Pearson assessment identified that assessment was better aligned with our student standards, while perhaps not quite as rigorous as the EPS assessment. I think the plan is to evaluate the results of these tests over time to see if we see any differences in terms of candidates who choose one assessment over the other in their performance. In the classroom, you could imagine a report much like the one that Spencer did today related to EdTPA, something along those lines.
Amy?
Yes,
For
Mike.
everybody, I think as we continue with praxis, I would like to go back and revisit the cut scores.
Okay, so Mike, I think that's going to be a great discussion. We're actually going to, at our board retreat in August, because, you know, we've had so many new members over the past couple years, Spencer's going to prepare a short memo on what are our licensure assessments, what are the cut scores, how did we come to them, how often are these assessments kind of reformatted by their vendor. And so we'll make sure that all members have that base of understanding and then think about how to best move forward.
And then I think also have the look at sort of the suite of licensure assessments that we require. So it's not just praxis, but now with EdTPA, what does that mean for what we know about a candidate as they come into the classroom?
Very good.
That's great.
Of course, we will add our EdTPA recommendation to this item. And then finally, there will be a small clarification on the professional assessments policy. There is a 912 endorsement that is not in our policy because it's in state law that says that if someone has been a college faculty member and has strong evaluation ratings, and then they can pass an assessment and a few other things, then they may be issued a license to teach in that content area for 912. We need to clarify which assessments they would be required to teach, so we will do that on this policy. And of course, the 912 will match our 612. So for example, where we have a 612 biology endorsement, the assessment that we require for that is the one that we would require for the 912 endorsement, and we'll make that clarification on the policy. So that's all I have, and unless there are any other questions related to professional assessments, I'll turn it over to Michael for leader preparation. Thank you, Amy.
All right, real quick update on leader prep annual report development. As a part of the data collection process in the past, EPPs have been submitting completer data on leader prep folks. However, we haven't been entirely sure how comprehensive that data is. So we are doing we're in the initial stages of analyzing that historical data. We're working with Jason Grissom out of Vanderbilt, who's done a whole lot of work in this arena. Our next steps are to determine which metrics we can begin looking at historical performance, and then define how those metrics are calculated and begin to set thresholds. So we anticipate bringing some folks together in a work group fashion to have those conversations in the fall. Last board meeting, there was a concern brought up about the reduction in experience requirement for admission to leader prep programs. We reached back out to work group members to share that concern and get their feedback on a possible revision to that recommendation. The LEA folks that responded supported the reduction. I think they want more flexibility there and believe that EPPs could use additional criteria for determining whether someone is prepared to enter a leader prep program. But the EPP folks actually supported maintaining the 3-year requirement or reducing it to 2. So we've done a lot of thinking internally about how we'd like to approach this revision to the recommendation, And where we've landed is we think we'd like to recommend a 2-year requirement, which would allow some autonomy for EPPs to consider other factors, and also recognizing that there's still the hiring process that would that LEAs would engage in that would allow for another gateway. And then also require a specific measurement of leadership potential. So this would be some additional language that we would propose. And then through the review process, we would ensure that leader prep programs are using some measure of leadership potential. This aligns really well with one of the metrics on the proposed leader prep annual reports, which is performance on the team professionalism rubric for folks who are teachers in Tennessee prior to entering a leader prep program. So I think that would strengthen overall the admissions requirement, but also back off of the 3-year requirement for admission to a program. Love to get your feedback on that if you haven't.
Michael, this is Lillian. I'm the one that brought that to the attention of the board because I was concerned. A teacher, after just being in the classroom 1 year, going into a leader preparation program, that was deeply disconcerting to me. I was concerned about that. I think 2 years is a compromise because if I understood you correctly, you're saying that the LEAs were in favor of reducing from 3 to 1. Is that correct? Did I hear you right?
Yes, but that to be completely honest, that was 1 or 2 people who responded to that.
Oh, okay. Okay. So 2 is certainly more reasonable than 1. I would be interested if there's time to get some additional feedback from the LEAs. I would certainly recommend that. I was very disconcerted by that one.
I think the other thing
2 is better than 1.
The other thing to note here, too, is that, because we heard from some EPPs that they would like to maintain the 3-year requirement, there's nothing prohibiting them from doing just that. And so having a 2-year requirement in policy, but recognizing that many LEAs will maintain that 3-year requirement would give us an opportunity to do some research in this arena and determine program completion rates. Are they different for folks who only had 2 years of experience versus 3 years? And then obviously outcomes we could look at as well.
That's a good point to make. Okay, thank you.
Okay. I think we're about close to wrapping up. This is just a friendly reminder. I'm actually preaching to the choir because all of you on the line have done this, but encourage your fellow members to provide feedback on the draft of the 2018-19 master plan that I shared a few weeks ago, ideally by this Friday, so we can incorporate all the member feedback possible into a final version. So feel free to send, a friendly text message or nudge or something like that as needed, or Sarah can do that as well.
Yeah, we'll reach out and try to get the last folks who haven't responded to respond, but thank you for your responses already. Lillian, anything else on your end to close out? I know we're a few minutes over time. I appreciate you all sticking with us. I think we were...
Just a couple of things. I want to thank everybody for the great presentations today. I appreciate everybody's hard work. I do want to point out to Mike and Lillian, and Bob, if you want to join us again, that we are planning to meet sometime in September, and our staff will poll us to determine when is the best time. We should be meeting in person unless we determine that maybe we can do this again over the phone, because I don't think that's cast in stone. But you can see by the agenda today, wow, it was even challenging to get through everything we did in an hour and a half. So that's the challenge, and that's the opportunity for us all. But thank you all very much. Hope you have a great rest of the day, and we'll see you in July.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great meeting.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Talk to you soon.
Okay.
Bye. It must be like a 2-hour minimum.